So let me read a portion, just small portion here, of a Star Tribune story from Saturday's edition. U.S. Rep. Erik Paulsen is joining a bipartisan effort in Congress to encourage states to pass laws that let law enforcement take firearms from people determined to be a danger to themselves or others. The state laws generally allow law enforcement officers to seize and keep guns from people who are suicidal or threaten others with violence. Part of what the representative said in a statement. As we learned in Parkland, shooting often before a violent crime is committed by someone coping with mental illness. The warning signs are there. But unless the individual is otherwise prohibited from owning a firearm, law enforcement is powerless to act. The representative is kind enough to join us. Erik, I appreciate the time. For those folks who are defenders of the Second Amendment and feel like this is going too far, what do you say?
Well, Chad, thanks for chatting about the very significant issue that we're hearing more and more about, unfortunately. Look, I mean, I support the Second Amendment. These tragedies have shown, however, there are gaps in our current system that need to be filled. And the reason a bipartisan group of us came forward to promote these red flag laws or gun violence restraining orders is that they're working in some states. Only a handful of states have them, but it makes sense to give law enforcement an additional tool because often these are not individuals who commit these atrocities suddenly snapping. Usually they do exhibit behavior that in many cases is reported to law enforcement. That's what was happening in Parkland. It's reported by someone who knows them. And so under those circumstances, it makes sense, and it's worked in Indiana where this is modeled after. Looking at folks maybe that have mental illness, they may commit suicide, they may do a tragedy and hurt others, and it's working. And so we should be promoting this across the country.
In this state, at the local level, at the state level, most Democrats wanted to push a version of this, and whether it was most Republicans or at least the leadership, they stopped it. Do you think the Republicans in St. Paul made a mistake?
Well, I think in Minnesota should be looking at this. I mean, look, again, this is bipartisanly supported, certainly for those of us that introduced this, at the federal level to encourage a state like Minnesota to do this. But, Indiana is a Republican state. This law has been in effect since 2005. It's been working not only to prevent tragedies from happening, potential shooting situations, maybe in a school and school safety, but also suicide. So, again, this is not infringe on the rights of law-abiding gun owners. This is finding a solution that's going to help prevent gun violence without infringing on those rights. And absolutely, we should be looking at the state level in Minnesota.
There's no doubt it is bipartisan in parts of the country, including Indiana, which you just cited. But can you say it's bipartisan if the Republican leadership made sure this didn't happen in the state this year?
Well, I know that there was a heated debate even in Florida from what I was reading after the Parkland tragedy occurred, but they were able to pass a version of this red flag law there as well. And that was just in the last couple of months as they concluded their session. So, issues like this sometimes bubble up, and it takes a little bit of discussion. So maybe the Minnesota legislature just needs to have some additional hearings in the interim, and as the session winds down to a close, I just think this is just something we don't want to ignore. We got to be paying attention to it. And in particular, I talk to so many parents and students. By the way, Chad, we've had the students that have been part of the walkouts, and they've got legitimate issues where they talk about concern about safety and security, and we should be addressing those. This is one clear way that we can fill a gap in the system and do that.
Let me give you a quote from the executive director of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, again in the Star Tribune story. We believe we should talk about strategies to help individuals when they're in crisis, but there are significant concerns we have about due process. Is that fair to be concerned about what the process is within our laws before we start taking guns away from people?
Well, absolutely. I will just say, though, that the version and the bill that we have introduced includes not only due process where law enforcement would step in, maybe take away a weapon from someone. There is a 10-day period where an individual then can go to a court. You have a straight due process system set up where they can retrieve their weapon. So you're going to have a review. But in the meantime, in a short period of time, if there's probable cause, you're giving a very important tool to law enforcement that can step in. And I think, look, these are situations where people usually see something on social media. They know something's not quite right with a family or a friend, family member or a friend, and they recognize something. And those are the kind of tips we should be encouraging, we should be looking at, and we shouldn't just brush them off under the rug and then regret it later when a tragedy happens.
Are we going to see a bit of a divide among Republicans on this particular issue, that those who represent cities and suburbs may be more inclined to support this, but those, not just here in Minnesota, but across the country, who represent more rural Minnesota, where the views might not be shared by some of their constituents, aren't going to be on board?
Well, that's certainly possible. There's a number of issues that we've been dealing with, at the federal level on immigration and health care that sometimes have a divide on rural and other splits, and it's not just party lines, geographic. But again, if you look at the legislation we've introduced to address gun violence here, this is based on an Indiana law that's been in effect since 2005, passed with a Republican governor, Republican legislature, and has a very rural component to its state makeup. And so I just think from a common sense point, this is a position or an opportunity to actually, improve people's lives. And that's what we should be doing, is legislating along those lines and not just ignoring a tragedy, but actually seeing, well, what are some things that we can do to make sure or help prevent another tragedy?
The president, after the tragedy in Parkland, had an event at the White House where both sides spoke out, including family members. Then he had a well-covered event, which was on national television with Republicans and Democrats, where he said he was very open to changes. He said he wasn't afraid of the NRA, that other people in the room were afraid of the NRA. Well, let's be honest, Congressman, nothing really has changed. Has the president moved enough since Parkland?
Well, the president himself, I think, even at one point during the Parkland tragedy, in the wake of that, was saying that he would be okay with confiscation of weapons without a due process.
Right.
Now, for those of us that believe that Second Amendment is Second Amendment, you've got to have the ability to protect the rights of law-abiding gun owners. So it's the administration is probably going to sit back and wait now for Congress to act or for the legislature to act. I'm just glad there's a bipartisan group of us that are pushing this, and hopefully that'll bring some more attention to the issue. And we do need the administration or the president's bully pulpit if we're able to be successful in the long run.
Two last points with Congressman Paulsen, then I want to get your feedback too after we let the congressman go. You want to chime in already, you can. 651-989-9226 or text 81807. Let me just pick up on what you said about the president, because I was watching also, like millions of others. And at one point, the president did say, as you pointed out, let's put aside due process and take away the guns now. What would have happened if Barack Obama would have said that?
Well, as anyone knows, regardless of who the president is, there lately in the last few years has been more of a polarization, unfortunately, with political parties and those involved and who are elected, and I think there would have been an uproar either way, regardless of who the president is, when you make a comment like that. And so,
but respectfully, sir, if Barack Obama would have said that after Sandy Hook, many Republicans would have absolutely been outraged, and some Republicans were when President Trump said it, but the reaction was very, very different.
Well, and you're right. Many Republicans absolutely would have said something immediately, as I would expect, even after President Trump made those comments. I think I was asked by someone, it's like, no, you have to respect due process. You've got constitutional rights. You've got to make sure that those rights are not infringed upon. And that's probably what has raised, quite honestly, a lot of suspicion among gun groups that are monitoring these laws as well. And it's what's made it more difficult, I think, to pass some more common sense measures. Thankfully, just a month ago, we actually enhanced some of the background check provisions. We actually lifted the ban on gun violence research that had been banned for a long period of time. Now, you don't hear much about that in the news, but those are positive moves forward to also preventing some of these tragedies.
Last thing is about you and an election. Since you came out, I've witnessed online people saying if this wasn't an election year, Congressman Paulsen wouldn't be speaking out in favor of this bill. How do you respond?
Well, I mean, it's ridiculous on its face. Look, I mean, as a legislator, when a tragedy happens or an incident happens, we look for opportunities to help improve people's lives. And I've met with a lot of folks, like I mentioned, students in particular in our community, because if you remember, it wasn't more than a few days after the tragedy happened in Parkland, we had the incident in Orono, and we had a lockdown. And we had law enforcement, though, step in appropriately, handle everything really well. But there were a lot of concerned parents and students in that situation. So this is an opportunity to fill a gap in the system, make sure that law enforcement has that tool to not only prevent a tragedy from happening, but also prevent a potential suicide from happening when someone's just not feeling right and they may have access to a firearm. And this is a way of preventing that.
Congressman, appreciate the time, sir.
Okay, thanks very much, Tad.
Erik Paulsen with us. Okay, we're going to have some time afterwards to take some calls and some texts. I would love feedback. Do you agree with what Congressman Paulsen said? Do you disagree? Do you want to see this law in the state? Do you want to see this as a law in the federal government, on the president? I made that point then. I'll make it again. If Barack Obama would have said what Donald Trump said, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, their heads would have exploded. The president then was counseled afterwards, and that's why nothing has happened. But do you want red flag laws stepping in, allowing greater latitude for law enforcement to step in more quickly than they can now, which for some raises due process questions? Chime in. You can call me, 651-989-9226, or text away 81807. Let me talk Roncore. It's a 38-year-old remodeling company which is having all sorts of success. Again, as I said, all aspects of residential remodeling. We zero in on the value bath program because the response from CCO listeners has been tremendous. Almost all of these jobs will get done in a week or two. Max, you might be the rarity, and it is a rarity where it takes a little bit longer. You could have all your ideas. You could have all your financing done. Great. Roncore will work with you. They have the A-plus Better Bureau rating. But for a lot of people, you want a little help from the interior decorating team. They've got great people. For a lot of people, you want financing. You can do your financing with Roncore right there from 18-month interest-free to low APR. Excellent company, good people. Check them out, roncore.com.